Good day, everyone. I'm Matt O'Grady, and I'm speaking to you from London. I'm joined today with my two co-hosts, Michele Strzera, who's in our Milan office, and Ranjit Langani, who's joining us from Dubai. We're obviously all with Nielsen, and we're here to present on this webinar today entitled Delivering Media Value Through and Beyond the Crisis. A couple of housekeeping items I'd like to mention before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you in the coming days for your future reference. So you will have an audio text of the webinar. All the listeners and participants are placed on mute so that we have the best listening experience for everybody. And we're going to do our best to accommodate any questions that come up or any interests that you may have pre-submitted with your registration. If you have additional questions, you can type them in the chat box, or you can email us afterwards, or you can contact your local representative so that we address those as well. Now, this presentation today specifically is aimed at our media clients, specifically the sellers of media in TV, digital, radio, print, out-of-home, and cinema. Yesterday, we hosted a very similar session that was oriented towards the advertisers, and that one was also recorded and can be distributed. So there'll be very similar content between yesterday's webinar and today's webinar. However, the implications and the trends for the media sellers and the media buyers will be different. So you'll have access to both. All right, so on our next slide, why are we hosting this webinar? We don't want to lose the opportunities presented by a crisis like COVID-19. COVID-19 has obviously turned all of our lives upside down globally, and I certainly haven't seen anything like this in my life or my professional career. But don't, as the phrase says, don't let a crisis go by without understanding or uncovering the opportunities that it presents. We at Nielsen are sitting on a wide, vast plethora of data. We collect and measure TV in 36 different markets and digital in 47 different markets. We collect consumer spending data in over 100 markets. So we have a vast library to pull from. We at Nielsen are behavioralists. We collect and report what people are viewing, what they're streaming, what they're reading, what they're watching, what they're buying. So we report the facts. Our business, I'm happy to say, has been incredibly resilient, and it has surprised us how much we can support our panel and our data collection methodologies throughout this crisis. So knock on wood, our currency metrics in many of these markets are doing very well. So today we want to lay out these facts. We want to give you this behavioral data and show you in a comprehensive and concise format what we're seeing, what trends we're seeing, and what implications. We understand that advertising has obviously had a severe pullback. That's understandable. Cash flow is an issue. Many businesses are down, many businesses are shut, and much has been said about that. However, we believe in this period there is an incredible opportunity to advertiser to much larger audiences, to wider demographics, and more engaged audiences than we've ever saw. In many markets, we're seeing up to 30 to 40% higher viewing levels than we've seen before. So for those that can continue to advertise or that can afford to continue to advertise, what that will mean is that when others go quiet, your voice gets louder. So I'm going to quickly review the agenda now, and then I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers. So, understanding the COVID anomaly. We've seen very high viewing levels or periods of media consumption in the past, but nothing as long and sustained as COVID has been. This is not like high viewing levels that you'd see in line with a sporting event or a 2-week Olympic period or a terrible storm or something to that effect. This is sustaining. So we want to talk about how are advertisers responding. And then secondly, how do you win? what winning techniques could we suggest for you in the crisis, and what will it look like after the crisis? So themes that will define media after the crisis and implications for their business we'll be sharing with you. So specifically now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ranjit in Dubai, who's going to discuss viewing trends, and then we're going to move on to Michele for some advertising trends. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the podium over to Ranjit.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. As Matt mentioned, in the first couple of sections of this webinar, we're going to stay focused on summarizing the current state of media during the COVID crisis. I will start with perhaps summarizing how media behavior is changing, and then pass it on to Michele to overview the advertiser response. Next page, please. Now, during my 17 years or so at Nielsen, I can recall of one client presentation that started with a quote from Lenin. But I thought this was in some ways a perfect metaphor for COVID's impact on media today. The current heightened state of media consumption will not be the new normal for COVID. However, it will serve as an accelerator towards greater digitization and more consumer experimentation tomorrow. Net, COVID in itself is not the new normal, but it is surely an accelerator to media's new normal. Hence, you'll hear us talk a lot about the term the COVID anomaly, because we truly believe the current state is nothing but a big anomaly. Next page, please, Chen. So I'm going to try and overview some of the top behaviors that we're seeing during this current COVID anomaly. The first changed behavior you might expect from being indoors is expanded TV consumption. Now, as you can see from this chart, TV viewing has expanded across the world due to a surge in news consumption, a heightened kids viewing kind of endeavor, and then really families using COVID as a way and using the TV set during COVID as a way to fight collective boredom. The growth, as you can see, is actually not the same everywhere, but it is generally in the 30 to 40% range versus the pre-COVID time period. Net, TV during COVID has jumped by roughly a third across many markets that we observe data in. Next page, please, Chen. The other consistent theme is that the biggest jump in TV viewing has actually been during non-prime hours. Now, given the fact that kids are at home, we're seeing a surge in children's programming during the day. We're also seeing spikes in news and general entertainment viewing over the otherwise relatively smaller bases of the morning and afternoon day parts. And we're also starting to see as families and kids and parents spend more time in front of the TV during the day, fatigue starts to set in as people reach the evening hours. And that's why the bump in expanded viewing is not as significant during the prime hours. Net, if I look at what we're trying to take away from this chart, is TV viewing is considerably higher, but considerably higher during non-prime hours during the COVID anomaly. Next page, please, Chen. Now, what we're looking at this page is the week-on-week TV viewing time across many markets. And there are three messages that I'd like to convey with this chart. The first one is that TV viewing, the curve of TV viewing, is really shaped by the intensity and the timing of the lockdown and restrictions in every market. Now, notice how the US peaks as it goes into the lockdown, and contrast that with Sweden on the right, where there really wasn't a pure lockdown, right? So look at how US peaks and then see how Sweden largely stays flat over the last several weeks that we've reported. The second message here is that viewing peaks and then flattens even during the lockdown or restrictions as viewer fatigue sets in. Now, the Philippines and Poland on this page are good examples of heightened consumption in the initial weeks and then sort of a plateauing of consumption a few weeks into the lockdown. And lastly, I'd like to draw your attention to Korea on the right, which is another good example on this page, because largely of the state of its recovery life cycle. As you probably know, Korea went into COVID a few weeks before some of the other markets on this page. And so what you can notice here is that the curve here is characterized not just by a flattening, but also by a dropping of viewing levels in the most recent weeks. We'll talk about life after COVID in the coming sections, but I just want you to bear this in mind that if you look at Korea, it's not just flattening, but it's also starting to drop. Next page, please, Chen. Now, the next big media consumption theme is the explosion of streaming. What you're looking at on this chart is the weekly view of streaming consumption of the latest 4 weeks versus the same period last year in the US on the right. And what might be the most striking thing you might notice on this page is that firstly, the absolute number of streaming minutes has more than doubled in 2020 versus 2019. Now, these levels are quite unprecedented. So to give you some context, in the last week, if we pick one date, which is the 4th of April, on that one day alone in the US, 27 billion minutes of streaming was consumed. Now, to give you a sense, that is 50,000 years of content streamed in the US in one day alone. So again, the number and the magnitude of streaming that we're talking about is quite unparalleled versus previous times. The other nuance here that you might notice is that amongst the key players, we also see a modest increase in the others bucket. Now, you may recall that the most notable recent launch in the US from the new streaming services has really been Disney+. And so you can see that that is making a dent in the others bucket in recent weeks as well. So the bottom line here is that the introduction of new streaming services has surely added to the strength of this streaming phenomenon, which again is almost doubling versus 2019 levels. Next page, please, Chen. And overall digital consumption has grown too, right? So we're not just talking about streaming, we're talking about overall digital consumption now. So on the left of this chart, you see some data from Australia, where we see that digital consumption grew 20 to 30% in March versus February of 2020. So on a month-on-month basis, we're seeing digital consumption expand across desktops, smartphones, and tablets by about 20 to 30%. We're also seeing that in 2020 in March versus the same month last year, so this is sort of a year-on-year comparison now. If you just look at smartphones as an example, consumption expanded by about 40%. So again, not just on a month-on-month basis this year, but even on a same period last year comparison, we're seeing that digital consumption is expanding. On the right-hand side, where we look at data from India, again, here we see that time spent on smartphones grew about 10% in larger urban India cities in week 4 of COVID versus a pre-COVID benchmark. So again, we see smartphone consumption expanding and overall consumption expanding based on the data that we've seen as 2 examples here. So the net story we've seen so far is TV consumption is up 30 to 40%, streaming is up, and overall digital consumption is up in this COVID anomaly period. Next page, please, Chen. Now, I wanted to give a little more color around the expanded digital consumption point that I made earlier. In the digital world, apps and services that encouraged and supported an indoor lifestyle surged considerably. On the left of this chart, what you actually see is some data from Japan, where we see that a lot of video apps, so apps like Prime Video, Hulu, Netflix, saw an expansion of unique audiences by 40 to 60% in Japan. Even YouTube, which is considerably well penetrated compared to the other 3 services, saw its user base expand significantly. So again, video apps in Japan were growing considerably during the COVID period. Over in Taiwan on the right, we saw that e-commerce and delivery services, so services that provided delivery and e-commerce efforts, as well as gaming apps in Taiwan, grew considerably in March 2020. The bottom line on this page is, if you're an app that makes indoor life entertaining or convenient, you stood to gain during this COVID anomaly period. Next page, please. The final consumer behavior that was on full display during COVID was heavy leaning into social media. Now, across the markets, we saw that the trajectory of social media activity had a great deal of consistency, generally getting active when the first local case was reported, spiking at the time of the lockdown or when restrictions came in by the government, and then really tapering off as the cases flattened. What you see on this page is but one example. It's an example from China. And you see that, again, as the COVID cases peak, the social media activity sort of tracks alongside. Now, Taiwan peaked at a similar time. We don't have that data up, but just to give you a sense, Taiwan peaked at a similar time. And then Korea had a similar trajectory, but Korea peaked later in February, because again, the trajectory of COVID was a little far apart between China and Korea. The bottom line with social media is that we saw that consumers first used social media as a conversation channel across markets. And this evolved into an information and news source as the COVID kind of period extended. So as COVID evolved in a market and matured, we saw social media first being used as a discussion channel and then being used as a news channel. Next page, please, Chen. Now, at this time, I will now hand over to my colleague and advertising intelligence expert, Michele Strezera, to summarize the advertiser response during the current COVID anomaly. Michele, over to you.
Thanks, Ranjit, and good day, everyone, of course, and thanks for being here with us. So we will try to give a picture to you about the advertiser response in this situation by analyzing two sets of data. On one side, we will look at advertising market trend, so ad spend information. On the other side, we'll be trying to give you a picture of the content, the communication that the advertiser has run to face this unprecedented situation. To give you a hint as a guideline for the presentation, and if I can summarize in a couple of sentences, very rough, the reaction was, hey, I don't have a clear picture of the situation, I don't have visibility, let's slow down. Next slide, please. As you can see from this survey run by IAB in March 2020, by interviewing 400 stakeholders in media agencies and companies responsible for buying media advertising, 70% of the respondents, they said that they already reassessed the media budget, either canceling everything or significantly lowering. And why? Because 3 out of 4 respondents, they thought that this crisis would have been worse or even much worse of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So it was a very human reaction to the situation. Next slide, please. And you can clearly see that from looking at the ad spend trends in different countries and in different regions. Let's take Hong Kong. I think it's a good example because it was one of the first countries where the COVID expanded and spread out. Hong Kong had a similar situation back in 2003 with the SARS. That happened between February and July of 2003. In February and March, the ad spend at that time still grew up compared to the same month of the previous year. There was then a downfall in April and May by 15%, but in June already, the advertising was going up again as a sign of recovery. Now Hong Kong had a -10 in January and the double -30 in February and March. That's a sign that the crisis hit harder, quicker, and deeper. Similar reaction in other countries in Asia, although with lower numbers, lower decrease. Australia had a behavior pretty similar to what happened to Europe and to US, as you can see. So for this country, Europe, especially the big country in Europe, February was a good month, even flat or growing compared to last year. But then the tsunami arrived in March. And you can see that the difference between, for example, Germany with -6 and Spain or France with -30, it's not given by the market specifically, but the timing of the lockdown, which is even clearer if you move to the next slide. That's the number of ads broadcasted on TV across the first 3 months and a half of the year compared to last year. So from the week 1 to week 16. As you can see, just in coincidence with the lockdown announcement from the government, the number of ads had a dramatic downfall, like a waterfall. And it's very clear because it's really exactly in correspondence with the lockdown. That means that before being a financial crisis, there has been a social crisis. The fact that we've been locked down in our free movement of citizens, that makes this crisis unlike any other precedent situation. Next slide, please. In Asia, the situation has been pretty similar. We've seen Hong Kong before. Philippines also had a big hit after the COVID. Other countries were on a softer side, like Thailand. Yeah, there was a decrease in TV ads, but not as much and pretty consistent. And Indonesia, in the first 3 weeks of March, they even see an increase of advertising. We have used TV data. We can have used data from any other media. The situation is pretty similar, actually even deeper. We use TV as a most representative media because the one with the biggest share. But also the other media has a big downfall, not to mention, of course, outdoor and cinema. Next slide, please. Digital I think, deserves a focus. We don't have a lot of history of digital. It's a relatively new media. If we look back at the crisis of 2008, 2009, digital was too small to take actually good hints for the future. But we have seen through our observation and the use of digital ad ratings product across the world that March had a big hit in terms of number of impressions. So we believe that there will be a decrease also of digital ad spend. Also because a part of the spine of the digital ad spend is made by small business, and small business has been heavily affected by the crisis. So we foresee that there will be a decrease, probably not as big as the traditional media, 20–30% less, but probably digital will be also the first media to restart again. Next slide, please. Second element, the industries. Of course, the hit created downfall everywhere, but some industries kept on investing. Retailers, for example, who are in this period, of course, if I may use this word, enjoyed a bigger turnover. They communicated a lot. Government had to communicate a lot, and that, guys, is a trend that will last in the future. Government needs to communicate more and more and in a more effective way, even using brands and media as a support. Personal services, for example, delivery or home connection, like the one we are using now. In media, of course, home entertainment has a big boost. Other sector had a more uncertain behavior, also depending on the region. For example, pharmaceutical is a good example. They increase in the Asia region because the medical equipment was available, at least at the beginning, so they could advertise. But in countries like Europe, and I can take Italy as a good example, medical equipment ran out of stock immediately, so there was no point to communicate. Fast mover consumer goods, food communicates quite significantly, and also household products, but drink went down, of course. Finance has a strange behavior because they didn't push a lot on the speed to communicate, and they started a little bit late. Some sectors, of course, have been heavily affected, and the usual sectors are automotive and tourism. In general, as we can see in the graph below, there has been a slowing down of essential communication, but services and social communication went up. And that's why we see in the next slide an increase of communication related to COVID. Still based on the research of IAB, 65% of the marketing managers have changed their communication in the last month, moving to social-related marketing or cause-related marketing or mission-related marketing. As you can see from this graph, which analyzing the new ads in the top 5 countries in Europe, taking the 100% of the COVID-related communication that appeared for the first time in March, 60% appeared in the last week of March, and only 1 or 2% were in the first week. So it was a huge push on the communication related to COVID and related to social. And that's across every sectors. Retailer, as we've seen before, was the biggest one. They made a lot of communication in terms of donation to food bank, making different opening hours to try to meet the needs of more vulnerable people, like elder people. They thank employees, the heroes, together with the National Health Service. They managed to try to create education. So social distance in the store, paying more with credit card and less with cash. And of course, they try to create also security among the people. Don't worry, we are here for you. We'll fill the shelves. You just come and buy what you need. So retail was very important and was very social. But I think going social, as I said before, was a trend for everyone. And we try to point out 3 different trends. Next slide, please. First trend was donation, charity. So we try to support health institutions and workers. We can see some example. We could have taken tens of other examples, honestly. Unilever Dove donated a worth of 100 millions of medical equipment, Budweiser donating to American Cross, HSBC donating to National Emergency Trust Fund. So donation was the first reaction. And then a campaign for free product for employees, especially National Health Services employees. So a free ride with Get and Uber, or also drinks free at Burger King. Next slide, please. The second trend was education, very, very important in this situation. And I think brand had a big part of it. Some of them emphasizes on social distance. I think a nice example of Mercado Libre, which is an Argentinian e-commerce company, whose logo is actually 2 hands shaking, who decided to change completely the logo and to emphasize on social distance. Also, McDonald's in some logo separated the 2 arches. Burger King changed its slogan. Nice example is also the one of Captain Obvious, the main character of the Hotels.com advertising. He's always saying, hey, get out from the couch, leave the social media, let's travel. And now he's saying he's going to be social distance for a while. Don't worry, we will travel again. A lot of home care, a lot of personal care moved to cleanliness, especially hand washing was a big trend everywhere, especially in the countries where hand washing is not such a common practice for the whole day. So education was a big trend. Next slide, please. The third trend was supporting people. Try to understand the condition of the people and try to support them in very different way. Some of them, for example, decided, like this French bank or Ford, to have more financial flexibility in payment installments. So try to meet the difficult financial situation of the people. Some of them just give free content. Barclays, for example, organize free coding courses for kids, and Fender gives 3 months of free course of guitar. So some way to get people busy at home with free content. But some of them, big companies, they decided even to move and to change their production plans, moving to the production of important materials for this situation. For example, some fashion brand moved, like Prada, to build new face masks, to create face masks, or Coty, for example, sanitizer. Bacardi decided to shift part of the production to create again gel and sanitizers, AB face masks. A lot of car companies moved to producing ventilators because of that technology. So that was the trend in general for everyone. But talking about reinventing activity, I think it's nice, and if we move to the next slide, to stress on one specific and to focus on one specific sector, which is sport. We could have given a different title to this slide, saying starving for sports, especially when we've seen the last day that 55 million of persons virtually attended the NFL draft, unprecedented audience. There was really a starving for sports, and a lot of sports moved to esports, from motorcycle to NASCAR and Formula One to football, but also especially to cycling. There was, I don't know if you know, but there was a classic cycling race, the Tour of the Flanders, which was run by 30 corridors from their home. And now in these very days, there is a virtual Madrid tournament. So is it a trend that will last after the crisis and when the live sport will come back? Difficult to say, but for sure it was a clever and effective way of keep the brand and the sponsor in contact with the consumers. Next slide, please. Now it's the time where the stay home, stay safe, it's a little bit less important. We are moving to, okay, we can go out again. We have seen in the third week of April, in 20% of decrease of mention in social media, blogs, news, and forum about the COVID. So it's really, there is the feeling of coming back again. We have to be careful, of course, but we are coming back again. So I can say something on that, because as you have seen before, a lot of advertisers moved to social communication, which was the right thing to do, probably. But that creates a lot of white noise in a certain way. So very difficult to stand above the crowd. But now it's time to differentiate. Next slide, please. I took a couple of examples of two sectors heavily affected by the crisis. One is automotive. There is a recent research in China saying that the public transport will have a big hit when we can go out again, and the private usage of the car will have a huge boost. That doesn't mean there will be automatically a purchase of new cars, because of course there is also the financial situation to take into consideration, but for sure there will be a lot of attention to the private cars, usage of the cars in the future. And that's why Jeep Chrysler already said, when it's all over, we'll ride again. Next slide, please. Tourism. We have seen some sign of recovery. I mean, of course, January and March were terrible, but hotel books in China in March have grown up again, and also flights. It's very unlikely there will be a lot of tourism in the next month, especially abroad tourism. But we believe that there will be a lot of stress on domestic tourism, for example. And I think that campaign of Portugal Tourist Board, it's very nice given the time being. It's time to dream of those amazing days to come. So give hopes. Next slide, please. So I try to summarize what we see in the first section of this presentation. As Ranjit said, TV and digital consumption expanded a lot and across the whole day. So there was more consumption across the whole day than before, of course. Consumers adopted in-home apps and streaming, so technology and social media became a key, not only for private conversation or social conversation, but also for sharing news. On advertiser side, we can summarize the response. So there was no handbook. It was difficult. So every reaction was legitimate in a sense in this way. So that's turned into an immediate slowdown of advertising. You can tell to your clients, even going dark was a legitimate reaction, although it was not useful, because going dark, of course, you lose connection with your consumers, you lose brand equity, you have a competitive disadvantage, and of course, some indicators of your brand equity will go down significantly. That's a fact. But understand them. It was a legitimate reaction. But you have to convince them, okay, now it's time not to be dark again. Other players decided to communicate just because the services were still naturally pushed on. And I believe that we still have to investigate how many services and opportunities will rise in this situation. The whole working from home setup is a new environment and will open to many, many opportunities because it changed a little bit our way of living. Other brands decided to go for enforcing the brand value. Again, and we have seen that everybody does in this way, creating a sort of, again, difficulty of differentiate. It was very important to maintain a connection, an emotional connection with your consumers, because consumers will remember who was beside them in these difficult moments. But now it's time to differentiate in the restarting, and that's where media can help a lot brand to differentiate. So there was a time to just being social. Now there is a time to differentiate ourselves. And of course, the social importance of advertising is huge in the perception of people. Believe me, people are dramatically affected by what they see on TV, even in advertising. And the tone of advertising, stay safe or just restart again, it's extremely important. So media and advertisers have a huge task in making this world start again. Actually, I can finish my presentation with a great sentence taken by a Guinness advertising run on St. Patrick's Day, when of course it was impossible to celebrate for a lot of people, and they came with this quite amazing spot saying, "Don't worry, we'll march again." And now, next slide. I pass over to Ranjit for what's next and the implications. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michele. So as Michele kind of spent the last few minutes talking about how consumers have behaved and how advertisers have responded during the crisis, let's start to paint a picture of tomorrow. So what's next? So what I'm going to try and do is I will start by outlining maybe the 5 big themes that will define media after the crisis. And then we will summarize implications for the sell side in terms of, what does it mean for your business? So Chen, next page, please. Now, the first key message in terms of themes that will define media tomorrow is that the recovery for the media market will be slow and heavily reliant on the interplay of several inflection points. And again, we're looking at this from a 2020 time horizon. On the left-hand side, I wanted to start by giving you a sense of changes in ad impression volume that we track in China before, during, and after the COVID crisis compared to 2019. And the reason I wanted to do that is I wanted to give you a sense of what that bounce back in advertising revenue, advertising volumes really looks like. And as you can see, the ad impressions before COVID that we were tracking in China were growing at about 20%. This is sort of before COVID hit. During the core COVID period, we saw impressions fall, and this was a deep cut by about 69%. And then we saw that a recovery happened. But the new growth rate was not the 20% that we were tracking before COVID, but they were more or less in the single digits. And I wanted to again share that because it gives you a sense of what the nature of the recovery and the timeliness of the recovery looks like. Now, overall, the bigger point I wanted to make on this page on the right-hand side is that really the nature and strength of these local recoveries will depend on a series of inflection points, right? So just to give you a couple of examples, when consumers or your viewers go back to school, right, or back to work, will really dictate the recovery of media outlets like print and out of home and terrestrial radio. The reintroduction of live sports will really influence, the advent of new sponsorship dollars coming into the media market. And so again, each of these inflection points will influence the rate and the nature of recovery for the media market. So that's sort of the first point we wanted to share. Chen, next page, please. The second key message is that we expect most of the surge in TV viewing to settle back down based on what we see in the early markets like China and Korea. Now, just so you know, the TV viewing peaks that we see in some of these markets tends to kind of flatten out just as the COVID cases curve flattens as well in those markets. So just to give you an example on this page, if I take Korea on the right as an example, the maximum number of COVID cases in Korea really peaked around the end of February. And so we saw that TV viewing in that market also peaked around the same time, roughly the first week of March. So we wanted to give you that context that again, because consumers are not going to be indoors all the time, because they're going to be keen to resume work, we are going to see that the surge in TV viewing that we saw during the COVID anomaly starts to taper off in the post-COVID periods. Next page, please. The third message is that advertising demand will continue to stay pressured through the first half of 2020. Now, there will be some recovery in the second half, but again, expect that there will be pressured ad budgets at least in the first half of 2020. What you're seeing on this page is really some insight from the IAB with a US focus, but it starts to give you some sense of what to expect, right? And what we're really seeing here is that even through June, we expect advertisers to cut deep, and those deep cuts will be more considerably felt in traditional and outdoor media types. So again, brace for a tough first half, brace for a slight loosening of pockets in the second half, and expect that some of the more traditional and outdoor media types will be more impacted than others. Chen, next place, please. Now, the fourth message that I wanted to convey is that as we look ahead, we continue to see audience supply exceeding audience demand for much of 2020. We call this the classic media disequilibrium. And basically what that means is even as, viewing levels drop and that supply of audiences drops a little bit, we still see that demand not keeping pace with that even drop supply as we go into the second half of the year. And you may ask why that is, right? It's a series of factors, but broadly it boils down to the fact that when you have falling consumer incomes and falling consumer confidence, that obviously has a bearing on how much consumption is going to happen at the retail shelf. And that obviously has a bearing on how tight business confidence is, right? So if businesses are not seeing a lot of sales, that obviously is going to mean, tighter media budgets. And essentially the picture that we want to paint is there will be some recovery in the second half, but there will still be kind of a demand supply mismatch through the end of the year. Chen, next page, please. And finally, not all media behaviors we're seeing from consumers during this COVID anomaly phase will stay, right? We have to remember that much of these record viewing levels during COVID were directly related to forced time indoors. So as lockdowns come to an end, consumers will revert back to the old ways, but with small changes, keeping the best parts of what they experimented with and what really resonated with them the most during this COVID phase. So just to paint a picture, right? Some may watch Netflix more than they did in the past, right? Others may video conference with family much more than they did before COVID. But not everyone will revert back to the COVID window phase, right? And what this really means is it could continue to be a great year for many media solutions on the left-hand side that really expanded their trial base, and some by the millions, right? So whether it is esports types of solutions or e-learning, right, or even video apps, right? A lot of those expanded their trial base, and obviously some part of that trial base will stay on even after the crisis. And on the other side, right, it'll continue to be a tough year for traditional and outdoor media around the world. There will be some recovery, but again, at an overall 2020 level, it will continue to be a tight year for some of these media types. And again, it's also going to be a tough year for those media businesses that are heavily reliant on small businesses. And a large part of that is, again, as small businesses figure out, right, what this economic shape up looks for them, their ad budgets will continue to be pressured, right, through the rest of the year. So again, a lot of winners and a lot of, again, players that will continue to have a tough year into 2020. Chen, next page, please. Now, the next thing that I'm going to try and do is talk about implications for your business. And I'll talk about 5 implications. But before I do that, I wanted to make 2 larger points, right? The first large point that I wanted to make is, we have to use COVID as a permit to really challenge your business's status quo, right? I like to quote, Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, who once, again, very famously said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? And for many in the media world, it's really a great parallel for what's happening with media in the COVID era, right? Perhaps the greatest silver lining of COVID is the fact that it gives media companies a permit to improvise, right? Really challenge how business is done today, how ad sales are sought, and really think of this as a larger chance to challenge the old ways of working. The second important point that I wanted to make, and this goes back to the reference that Matt made earlier about the webinar we hosted yesterday, I do want to call out, just in the spirit of transparency, that the big message we gave advertisers yesterday is that you have to err on the side of advertising during these atypical times. So I did want to level set with this media owner audience that the message we gave advertisers is that actually now is not the time to go dark. Now's the time to lean into the media channels that you want to support and spend. So err on the side of spending more. So now I'll cover the next 5 slides with 5 quick implications. Chen, next page, please. So let me start with the first big implication for media owners and the sell side, which is really for the need to get hyper prioritized with prospecting around ad sales, right? So we've already given some examples, and Michele covered this in terms of who's having a good year and what are the sectors that are overspending, right? Names like retailers and e-commerce and gaming and work enablement softwares. But you really have to rally around these client opportunities, right? So this is a good example on this page from Australia. We know that governments around most countries, right, around most of the world, are going on the offensive with social and health messaging. So as you can see here, right, in the last 3 weeks alone versus the same period last year, the Australian government doubled their ad impressions, right, in that market. So essentially the key takeaway here is ensure that your ad sales team is hyper targeting and really following where the money is more than ever. Chen, next page, please. Now, the second thing I wanted to call out is that we have to understand and acknowledge that media buyers in this market will have leverage this year, right? And as they shop around, in addition to price, they will also look at who better meets their needs overall. So we looked at some IAB research that suggested that a lot of advertisers will actually shift tactics and prioritize certain activities, right? So, what we're seeing here, and maybe the most striking thing on this page, is one of the tactical things they're expected to do is actually lean more on targeting, right? More than ever. So as a media owner, as a platform, what you have to be really prepared for is to offer a wider suite of data and analytics around your audiences to these buyers, right? So think about the fact that you're competing for their dollars. They're looking for things like targeting. So try and enable your suite to offer up, again, more data around your audiences, more analytics, and more options to be able to lure their spends towards your platform. Next page, please. Now, one of the biggest upsides for many digital publishers, platforms, and TV broadcasters with COVID has been a surge of trialists and really the return of lapsed viewers. So think about that as, what should your strategy be to retain and expand reach after COVID? Consumers will be coming out of a tough phase, right, in terms of heavy media consumption, so there will be some viewer fatigue, and then they will be going into a phase of economic recovery. So think about, as consumers grapple with those aspects, right, how do you keep trialists into your franchise even after COVID? So here are some ideas, right? Consider bundling or reaggregation as a means to have them stay within your franchise, even if it means incenting the consumer with a discounted offering, right? The other thing you may consider, as ESPN did with ESPN Plus, is other low-cost products or services that, again, allow households to participate in some of your content, even if it means it's at a reasonably lower price, right? So the goal is to keep them within your franchise and give them the option to stay there, even if they have to upgrade later. So these trialists are really your COVID treasure, if you may. So work hard to retain them. Chen, next page, please. Now, for media owners, COVID calls for accelerated digitization and platform or channel diversification. I thought this was actually a good example of platform extension, right, for one of our clients. So Spotify, as you can see from this case study, has about 271 million monthly active users. But the one thing that you may not know is that, most of these streaming solutions actually lose money, right? Because there's huge loyalties to be paid, right? Sometimes loyalties can be as high as 65 to 70 cents out of every dollar in revenue. So Spotify noticed the fact that its music business was not as profitable, but that podcasting was not only profitable, but also a growing business, right? So just to give you a sense, in 2019, and in the last quarter of 2019, podcasting actually grew by 200%. So what Spotify did is it activated kind of an opportunity where it said sports is one of the most popular genres on radio and podcasting. I'm going to spend $200 million to acquire a platform called The Ringer, which was a sports and pop culture podcast founded in 2016 by a former ESPN columnist. And essentially what they did is they actually moved away from maybe a not as profitable solo focus on the music business to a music and podcasting opportunity, right? So as of, again, the last few months, as I mentioned, Spotify has hundreds of millions of active users, and it's starting to not only diversify its business, but also add more opportunities for monetization by getting into more profitable businesses like podcasting. So again, the bottom line here, it's always been good in the media business to diversify and add more monetization firepower. But with COVID, as consumers are on this accelerated digital uptake, And as traditional media outlets have almost received a double punch, right? Getting into new monetization opportunities and digitizing your platform opportunities is perhaps more important than ever. And then, Chen, if we can go to the next page, please, for my last implication. So the final thing I wanted to really call out is, there's obviously been a lot of uncertainty when it comes to COVID around fresh programming. But as the reintroduction of fresh programming is awaited by many, and those plans come back on, right? It's important for media owners and content producers to not just stick to the old schedule, right? So what was really on pause to really unpause that. Because it's important to bear in mind that programming choices will need to be viewed against the new set of litmus tests that we really have to look at in a post-COVID world, right? So questions like, is this programming choice susceptible to closure? Is it relatively a less strain and a less burden to produce, right? And what are some consumer themes that we have to bear in mind in terms of programming that will really resonate with viewers in a post-COVID world, right? So just to give you one small illustration, I was having a chat with one of our US-based media colleagues, in the Nielsen franchise, and they were quick to remind me that in the post-9/11 timeframe in the US, there was a lot of research done, and what we found that consumers were actually actively seeking uplifting content in the time after 9/11. So those are the types of questions and really challenges that we'll have to have within our organizations as we think about what that fresh programming wave looks like. The bottom line here is, don't just resume stalled programming plans, but revisit those in the context of a new content creation strategy after COVID. So those were really my 5 implications. I hope some of those implications will give you at least something to think about. As we transition to the next slide, I'd like to hand it over to Matt to bring us home. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Ranjit. Thank both you and Michele for your insights, your observations, and an excellent presentation. I'd like to summarize what we've heard over the past 45 minutes just in a couple minutes and drive home some key points that we want to leave you with. First of all, there are some pros to call out. And number one is the higher media engagement that we're seeing. So that's higher viewing, that's higher streaming, that's higher reading, that's higher listening. We're seeing it across the board. These are very engaged audiences and often younger demographics that you may have not captured before. So that's positive news. And along with that is the expanded reach. As Ranjit had called out, the trialists, the people that are on trial, do your very best to hold on to them and convert them to long-term customers. And all of these accelerated new media behaviors open up opportunities, for advertisers to engage. So whether it's the indoor apps, the rise in streaming, or targeting of ads, which is happening now in mass mediums as well as traditional targeted meetings, podcasting, connected TV or over-the-top TV, and the digital ads that go along with that. These are all huge opportunities, to promote your platforms, to promote your media properties. Obviously, there's some downsides. There's plenty of challenges ahead of us. The impending recession with the drop in both consumer and business sentiment is real. It's upon us. We know that's going to happen. There will be extensive challenges for some media more than others, like out of home, cinema, events, traditional sports. But we do expect somewhat of a recovery in the second half. As I said, we're behavioralists, we're not forecasters, but we do believe that we will see some uptick in the second half of 2020. But this just leaves us with an economic situation that is uncertain, and advertiser budgets are under great pressure. However, as Ranjit and I both said before in our webinar yesterday and to our advertiser clients, we think it's critically important to support the platforms and any media outlet that they're used to supporting today. But we've seen wonderful things that have come out of this as well. Look at the creative ads that Michele and the examples that he gave us. The creative response to COVID, with new ads that are both emotionally connecting, that are compassionate, are also effective. So that's been a terrific response to what had traditionally been a ban on any news related to COVID. We're seeing a crack in that armor, and appropriately so. But the recovery will be slow. It will probably travel by region, as did the COVID virus travel by region, and the outbreak starting in the east and heading to the west. But coming out of this, as we said, we all need to question the status quo. We are not going back to business as usual. We will have continued virtual relationships and digitization of our relationship with our current customers. And we need to work to build those virtual bridges with all consumers. But I just ask all of you to remember to question what you had been doing, and hopefully the insights that we provided you will help you with that. So, Nielsen's promise to you on the next slide. During the crisis, after the crisis, we will do our best to illuminate the truth. As I keep saying, we track and report and measure what people are reading, what they're listening to, what they're watching, what they're streaming, what they're observing, what they're buying. So we know the truth is more important now than it ever has been. We will continue to invest in all of our methodologies and data collection techniques to ensure that both our associates and our panelists are safe, while continuing to support the necessary metrics with which you trade on. So it is certainly a challenge working in this environment today, but we will continue to prove, that our business is future-proof and that you will be able to rely on Nielsen in the future. I want to thank you all very much for joining us today. We enjoyed sharing our thoughts with you. We hope the insights were helpful to you. And please, if you have any other questions for us, please email us or contact your local Nielsen representative. And thank you very much for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.